Hi everyone, we're just waiting for a minute or so to let as many people join as possible before we get started. Great, we'll get started now. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm here to introduce the session. So this is the NFFN's Hedgerow Masterclass. Just before we begin, just want to do a few bits of housekeeping, just so you're all aware of a few things. So this session is being recorded, and we're going to make the recording available online on the NFFN website and on the NFFN YouTube channel for anybody that couldn't make it tonight and would still like to see it. As this is a webinar, your video and audio have been disabled, but we've got the chat box open, and we were also going to have the Q&A box functions working as well. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box. If you put a question in the chat box, we're probably not going to be able to see it as easily, and it won't probably be answered. We'll try and keep an eye in case people do get mixed up, but please try and put them in the Q&A box. Within the Q&A function as well, there's going to be an upvoting system. So if there's a question that you see that you were thinking of asking that somebody else has already asked, try and upvote it, because we'll get to the ones that have got the most upvotes first as well as we go through when we get towards the end. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session, and depending on time, we may or may not be able to get through all of those, but we'll attempt our very best to get through as many as possible. And at the end of the session, any resources that are mentioned, we'll send out a pack to all of you to let you know of any links or studies or anything like that that's mentioned. So the idea behind this webinar really came about from a webinar that we hosted back in March, which covered hedgerow and woodland management, and it was hugely popular then, and the number of questions we received, we just couldn't get through them all in the time. So we thought it'd be really great to do a follow-up workshop, which is this one, where we could actually answer more of those questions and do a bit more of a deep dive into hedgerow management in general. It also comes at a crucial time for hedgerows more generally as well. In 2024, the process of delinking will finally occur, meaning that the cross-compliance regulations which protect hedgerows will no longer apply to farmland in England. Cross-compliance goes over many areas, and in most cases, the fact that we're losing cross-compliance doesn't pose as much of a problem, and because the rules that are in cross-compliance are underpinned by other legislation, domestic legislation, but that isn't the case for hedgerows. And whilst there will still be some protection for hedgerows under domestic legislations, the loss of the cross-compliance rules means that any protections under the GAEC 7A will be lost, and that includes the kind of buffer strip maintenance to within 2 metres of the centre of the hedge, where you're not allowed to cultivate or apply pesticides or fertiliser. All of that will be lost, and also the hedgerow cutting or the kind of ban that stops you from cutting between the 1st of March and 31st of August will also be lost. So the loss of these protections would likely cause damage to hedgerows and the biodiversity is reliant on these ecosystems. So it's really important that we make sure that we're getting our views heard about hedgerows. On that note, DEFRA actually have put out a consultation on hedgerows at the moment. We're sending in a response, but we're also hoping to get some responses from our members as well. So if you are interested in hedgerows and hedgerow protection, we will be compiling some draft letters that you can tweak to your own liking, but that they'll be made available to all of our members to help you respond to the consultation if you so wish. We're also going to be launching soon a campaign called to celebrate healthy hedgerows called Hedgecation. So if you'd like to get be involved in that, which is sharing stories from your farm of how you manage your hedgerows and why you like having healthy hedgerows, I'll put the links and who to contact in the chat box after my speaking bit's over. And if you're a member, you'll get all those details sent to you directly anyway. So moving on to the kind of main event of this webinar, which you're all here for, the focus is really to explore in detail the best practices for hedgerow planting, management and maintenance. This evening, we're going to hear from James Robinson, who is NFFN England's Vice Chair and a 5th generation organic dairy farmer from Cumbria, and Megan Gimber of the People's Trust for Endangered Species, who has developed and manages their 2 hedgerow surveys, the Great British Hedgerow Survey and Healthy Hedgerows. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to James Robinson, who's going to give you a talk about the hedgerows on his farm.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that, Lottie, and hello to Megan as well, and hello to you all. I am going to attempt to screen share, and hopefully there'll be a bit of a apologies if I get this wrong. There we go. So hopefully you can see that. So briefly, our farm, 300 acres, so it's a nice round figure. It's been in the family since 1875. I'm the 5th generation, and there's our Robert, my son, 19-year-old, who is the 6th generation. We're all grassland. We're in South Cumbria, so we get plenty of rain. Don't often suffer for drought. It's it's a challenging farm, lots of small fields surrounded by these wonderful hedgerows. So that's kind of why I've ended up in a bit of a hedge nerd situation. We've got 250 head of cattle altogether, so that's 120 dairy cows, and they're all pedigree dairy shorthorns, so traditional breed, great for grazing these steep banks and things. And then you know, the shelter from the hedges and everything just makes it fantastic. We've got 130 young stock as well on the farm, and then also a small flock of herd week sheep. And if I can go on to next, so there we go. But yes, it is a diverse landscape. So we've got lots of small fields. Half of it is permanent pasture. It's permanent pasture because it's either too steep or too rocky to plough. But like I say, it does make it really interesting. 14-acre woodland, species-rich hay meadow, ponds, wetlands, and loads of different species of grasses. But we're here to talk about hedges, so hedges I will talk. This is actually a really badly managed hedge, and it is a hedge that we bought, a hedge on some land that we bought about 5 years ago. My dad, who's now 75, has never ever seen this laid. It's on neighbouring land to us, so we're looking onto it all the time. So this could potentially be 100 years since this has been laid. All these stocks that are left are just Hawthorn stocks, and that's probably about the only thing that will grow and be constantly nibbled by stock. So it was unprotected and it hadn't been laid, and it ended up that we had to coppice all this off. And all that was left really, once we coppiced it off, I think about half of them were dead. So there was very little actually grew. But then we've replanted it and it's turned into a nice hedge now. But that is how hedges can be mismanaged by not managing them at all. And then on this side, we've got, I hope you can see my cursor when I'm pointing. On this side, we've got an overmanaged hedge where they've just been hammering it with a flail for, you know, every year for God knows how long, and it's ended up in a little box with little, just looks like little mushrooms sticking up, and that is a overmanaged hedge. So undermanaged and overmanaged, either way, it's not the right type of management. So this is another hedge that we had left go quite bad. So you can see this is back to 1993. It again was really woody, really gappy in between. No protection, and it had been a long time before it had been laid, and all that was left really was some holly and these hawthorns. So yeah, we copied some off, we we laid some, even these big ones can be laid if you pull them on the root and stuff, and then double fenced, and then you end up with that. So no hedge is beyond redemption, really. It's you can, you know, as long as it's living, you can coppice them off and you can get a lot of new growth, even if they are massive. Every hedgerow species in this country will grow from a coppice stock. So you can see the thick growth from the old coppice stocks. We planted up in the gaps and everything, and then within 10 years you've got fantastic shelter again and a nice thick base. And then we'll move on then to managing it again, where you can see we've been laying it. And that's the first time it had been laid since 1993. So it was a long time in between, but it took a long time to establish into a decent hedge again. But next time, that will be an even better hedge, you know, so once all the new plants and everything have matured again. So, yeah, it's just a good way of managing them. And yeah, it can look fairly savage when you're managing hedges. This is a newly laid one, like I say, 11th of March. And then immediately you get all this new stuff growing. So we've got all the bluebells and what have you, and all the new shoots coming. And then by midsummer, you've got that. So it can look fairly savage, especially when you're laying a lot of these big hedges like we have. They quickly do regrow again. So big hedges, that's Dad looking up, wondering what the hell we're going to do with some of these. These are big hazel, big nuts. And yeah, we go a long time in between. So we've got a lot of hedges, 7 miles of hedges we've got on the farm, and we do a 20 to 25 year rotation, which then ends up that they are 7 to 10 meters high and yeah, up to 8 meters wide. So, you know, they are big, but they are fantastic. They're full of wildlife. Interestingly, hedgerows sequester 50% more carbon than woodland, and that's because they are so thick, they're really dense. So well-managed hedges are just absolutely full of carbon, and it always amazes me really that when they're talking about planting trees, I think planting more trees, I think if we just managed our hedges better, we could gain far more and not lose any agricultural ground, as it were, for tree planting. Wide and thick are best. Blackthorn and bramble fill the void of the canopy. So what you get like the hazels and the hawthorn will grow fairly straight up, and then they'll slowly bend over a little bit. And then underneath you get things like the blackthorn and the bramble that fills this gap underneath. And then you get a real thick, dense hedge that is just fantastic for wildlife and for shelter. We use all this firewood in between here. We use all this firewood for heating our 2 farmhouses. We don't really buy any oil or anything through winter. We use very, very little because we've got enough firewood to heat with the wood burners. And then the smaller stuff, the smaller brash, of which is not much really, because a lot of it's just big, then gets chipped back onto the hedge bank. So yeah, healthy hedgerow, benefiting everything, shelter for livestock and crop, and that could be just grassland, but it's going to benefit as well. Wildlife corridors, you know, for linking up, you know, diverse species and things, especially with bats. You know, we all love bats. Natural food source for all the wildlife as well. And they are really part of our heritage and identity, and that I think is worth, that's worth saving them alone, I think. You can't imagine, especially Cumbria, you couldn't imagine Cumbria without hedgerows, you know. And when we've just been to Crete on holiday last week, flying back over, you see all the green as soon as you come into you know, like central England towards the north, see all the green, but you see all the hedges as well, and that is just part of our identity and really part of our own well-being as well. So it's something that I know I would struggle without hedges to help me through that way. Water storage as well, they're just fantastic for that. I'll just skip through that. And yeah, so that's me and that's Dad, and that there with a red helmet on is Robert. So it's something that we do, 3 of us, 3 generations. It's a real generational thing, and it's something that we can really well, it's something that you can do with the other generations of your family, that older or younger, knowing that the next generations on are going to be looking after it in the same way. You're really preparing something for the future.
Thanks for that, James. That was really interesting and great to hear about how you all work together on your farm to manage your hedges and why they're such an important feature for you. So I'll hand over to Megan now, who'll be going through all the key details on hedgerow management and maintenance.
Right, once I have worked out the share screen, let me just have a look. hopefully you can see a picture of my face above a laid hedge. Could you give me a nod if that's, yeah, I'm hoping that's it. So I'm Megan Gimber. I work for People's Trust for Endangered Species, where technically I'm the key habitats officer, but really I just work on hedges. I'm like James, a bit of a hedge nerd. Why is an endangered species charity involved in hedges? Well, to me, that's obvious. They are incredible for wildlife. Recently described as the single most important ecological building block left in this country by George Eustace. And one study found 2,070 different species just in one 85-metre stretch of hedge in Devon. 2,070 different species, and I find that absolutely mind-boggling. The vast majority of those were insects, but we all know how important insects are to everything up the food chain, to the birds, to the mammals, to the bats, those sorts of things. And the author of this study, even he thinks this is an underestimate of the true number. So just imagine, you know, that's 85 metres of hedge. Imagine what they can have nationwide if we make sure that we manage them in a way that they're healthy. So as to how and why a man-made habitat is so good for wildlife, it's a bit complicated, but I think it's fascinating. The short version of this is that hedgerows are what we call an ecotone, which is where you've got various sort of overlapping elements of habitats. And this one sort of mimics the rich habitat that you find at a woodland edge. So they've got overlapping elements of woodland, flowering scrub and grassland habitat, and even a bit of wetland if your hedge is lucky enough to have a good wet ditch running alongside it. And this means they're capable of supporting lots of species from each of these habitats. So 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species also live in hedges. And it turns out there's a lot of wildlife that thrives not just in a hedge because it's got their corresponding habitat, but because they really appreciate this combination of habitats. So actually, sometimes more than the sum of its parts. So the example I use a lot is a song thrush. So it will territory mark and sing from hedgerow trees. It nests in the dense hedge structure. It feeds on snails and worms and stuff from the hedge base, again, especially if you've got a good wet ditch. And then it moves on to hedge berries from the hedge later in the year. A dormouse will feed from the flowering and fruiting scrub plants, but then also on things like ash keys and insects from hedgerow trees. It will weave its breeding nests into the protection of the scrubby structure of the hedge itself. But then it'll do its winter hibernation nests at the ground level, perhaps in tusky grass at the hedge base or at the margin. Then we've got brown hair-streaked butterflies. They will obviously lay their eggs on young blackthorn stems, but they use the sheltered side of a hedge to gain the body temperature needed to fly. And then, of course, they congregate around hedgerow trees, normally large ash trees, actually, in order to find a mate and then mate. So again, you know, the closer you look at our native ecology, the more species you find that really thrive in this sort of woodland edge habitat. And this is because it's a similar combination of features to what we would have had pre-agriculture, the pre-agricultural wildwood, and that's what they will have adapted to, of course. So, you know, we didn't have wall-to-wall closed canopy. The evidence suggests we would have had more of a mosaic of habitats, you know, different stages of growth in a dynamic landscape, sort of constantly in motion through the grazing, the browsing, the crashing and the crunching of large herbivores. So there would have been patches of woodlands, of course, but there were also glades, areas of scrub, areas of pasture, scattered open grown trees, and of course there would have been no sort of dividing line. So there would have been a big sort of area of what we now call woodland edge. And with hedgerows, we've just sort of squeezed that amazing habitat really into lines whilst we farm the fields in between. So we might have lost some of the sort of spatial dynamism, but actually we can make sure that our hedges keep that magic combination at this really valuable stage of succession through changing how we manage them over time. And this means managing them on a life cycle, keeping them at that sort of succession sweet spot and resetting them when they mature past it. So this isn't any new way of managing hedges. As turns out, this is what we've been doing for centuries. Managing our hedgerows according to their life cycle, we keep the dynamism. We reset the succession by laying or by coppicing when it's getting to a point of maturity, And that way we sort of create a habitat that's both useful for us as a hedgerow, but also, you know, ecological dynamite for our wildlife. So in this form, as a network of hedges covering the whole of the country, they perform really incredible roles for wildlife. They're home, so things nest in them, breed in them, overwinter in them. You know, think hedgehogs, think dormice, insects, birds. They're food and they're shelter. Things will hunt alongside them, forage for berries, that sort of thing. And they're also connectivity, so helping connect populations that would otherwise be isolated and vulnerable. Again, really important for things like dormice. Interestingly, for things that fly as well, which, you know, isn't necessarily what you'd think of first. And this combination of roles is how, you know, 85 meters of hedge on Dartmoor can support over 2,000 species. It's amazing. And of course, you know, using this knowledge, we can use this knowledge to help guide our management. And all of our management decisions can be made better by understanding how they'll impact not just the structural elements of a hedge, but also, you know, keeping in mind how these hedges function for wildlife as well. So how do we manage for healthy hedges? Most of this will be a little bit of repetition of what James has just said. There might be a couple of tiny bits in there, I don't know. But firstly, you know, we do need to manage our hedges to stop them developing into a line of trees. So without trimming or without any sort of management at all, our hedges have a natural tendency to grow upwards, becoming tree lines. So this is actually sped up because they're planted so close together that they compete for light and they just race up. So a line of trees doesn't sound like a bad thing, but of course that loses that sort of dense, tight, scrubby structure, and you end up often losing that sort of flowering scrub element of our habitat. And of course, when it gets to this point, you've got a line of trees. The trees will then start to topple, they'll get gappy, eventually lost, and then you lose the sort of the connectivity element as well. So, you know, it's not great for the hedgerow habitat. And the management that prevents this, it could be trimming, it could be laying, coppicing, it could be a combination of the two. So how does trimming affect a hedge? So trimming hedges changes the balance of hormones in the plants. So cutting off the growing tips basically takes out that hormone that encourages them to race for the sky. And this means they put more effort into the branching growth instead. So you take out that top bud and a few buds further down spring into action, you get more lateral growth. And you can actually utilize this sort of natural plant response to help create a dense hedge if you want to, creating sort of that density that gives really good shelter and nesting habitat. And you can do that by trimming a young or maybe recently rejuvenated hedge slightly higher, slightly wider, slightly higher each time, creating that sort of really good density. I'm going to skip past this, but we might come back to this later on, how I think establishing a good hedge can happen. And how not to establish a good hedge. But once you have got a good sort of well-established hedge, if your hedge management does involve trimming, then knowing that most of our hedge plants blossom and fruit on young wood, second-year wood and older, gives us two trimming options that mean our hedges still satisfy the sort of flowering scrub wheel of our ecotone. So firstly, longer trimming rotations. The photos shown in this slide are from Martin Lines of the NFFN, and they elegantly show, I think, how well a 3-year rotation impacts the blossom of a hawthorn hedge. And of course, with blossom comes fruit. You know, you can have a hugely diverse mixed species hedge. But if it's trimmed, you know, to the same height and to the same width each year, you cut off most of that potential. So you massively reduce, you know, how beneficial it is to wildlife. The second option is incremental trimming. So this is now coming into the sustainable farming incentives as an option. And this is basically where you just cut higher and wider with each cut. And this is a really, really simple management tweak that means you get like a border of young wood around your hedge every year. Even on cutting years, you'll get flowers, you'll get fruit, and you end up with a really thick, dense hedge. And it's tidy if that's of any importance to you. It's not to me, but you know, to some people it is. But this way you avoid doing any structural damage to the hedge, and also you don't end up blunting your flail tool on the knuckle of scar tissue that you get built up at the sort of static trim line. But for me, a really great advantage of adopting this incremental trimming technique is that hedges that might otherwise be in a static trimming regime sort of naturally grow and start moving through their life cycle once more. So it's really just getting into gear, getting these hedges back into that sort of life cycle type management. And I personally think the results of this one speaks for itself. This is a hedge that's trimmed every single year, so quite intensively, but it's trimmed higher and wider each time. So this is what's achievable even under annual trimming. And then sometimes, you know, it can be best to do nothing for a while. Let your hedge grow out, let it grow big, let it grow blousy. I think they're really beautiful. They're certainly really bountiful when they're at this stage, and they can provide amazingly for wildlife for a number of years before you actually need to go to the next stage of the life cycle. But lastly, I would sort of reiterate the point that James was making here. No matter how well you manage your hedge, they do need rejuvenation at some point. This could be laying, or it could be coppicing, depending on the condition of your hedge, or you know what your preferences, or what's sort of more suitable in your area. But basically, this resets that hedge life cycle. It thickens them back up from the base, and from here you can start the whole process again. So it resets that cycle of succession, allows a fresh start. And really, I just can't stress enough, without rejuvenation, hedges, no matter how well you manage them, will inevitably decline and then be lost. So to me, I just find it incredible to think that the reason we have so many of our ancient hedges, and some of our hedges are truly ancient, is thanks to an unbroken chain of care. So centuries of care they've seen, with periodic rejuvenation, maybe once a generation each, through their many centuries. So to me, this is just a superpower. Hedge layers make hedges immortal. The skills and the management passed from farmer to farmer, generation to generation, is what makes our hedgerows survive. But I think it's, you know, it's right to acknowledge that they will only survive if we keep doing that, if we keep offering them that sort of care, consideration and rejuvenation. So whilst we're at it, you might recognise the silhouette of this chap here. Rejuvenation is a great time to establish new hedge trees. So hedge trees are massively important, and they improve the hedgerow habitat. Over half of the priority species that live in a hedge require hedgerow trees to be there. They're one of our three sort of wheels of the ecotone. Again, they store carbon without taking any land out of productivity. And they do so, if you establish them like this, without having to be bought, without having to be planted, without having plastic spiral guards or watered or whatever. You know, a fantastic way of establishing hedge trees. We've lost a huge number of hedge trees. We lost loads to Dutch elm disease. We are living through a similar thing with ash dieback now, sadly. And because, you know, largely our trimming practices have meant that we've actually established fewer in more recent decades as well. So we do really need to be looking at how many hedgerow trees we've got and trying to improve them. So if you put all of that together, you get this, which is the hedgerow management cycle. This is my favourite ever diagram. It's based on work by Nigel Adams of the National Hedge-laying Society. And what it shows is that hedges are dynamic, they're living, and no matter where you are in this cycle, there is a purple arrow and a garish pink box to tell you that there's a way of bringing it back into that good, healthy life cycle again. So in the centre, that central wheel, that's what we think a good life cycle might look like. It might include trimming, incremental trimming, long trimming rotations, periods of non-intervention. It will always need to include rejuvenation, as I said. But depending on how you manage your hedge, you might need to do that only ever up to 40 years, depending on whether you're trimming as well. The side flanks are the problem areas. This is if you leave your hedge with non-intervention too long on the tall and overgrown side, or if you go the opposite way and over manage, they start to lose density at the base, they start to get a bit gappy and generally sort of fade away from the countryside. I think what I'd say about this image is it might look a bit prescriptive, but within this image, within that natural cycle, there's actually a huge amount of flexibility. Trimming hedges can extend the period of time between laying up to about 40 years, if that's something you're interested in, or you can choose to have all of your hedges or some of your hedges in non-intervention laying or coppiced cycles. You can weight your hedges to spend more time in different ones of these categories. Depending on the needs of your farm, your preferences, the only thing that's essential really here is the rejuvenation element. And the cycle isn't reinventing the wheel, but reflects what we've always been doing. At the top here, we've got a traditional hedge layer. The first written instructions of this were 1573. It's not something that's been made up recently. It's been going on for centuries and centuries. And traditionally, sometimes hedges were on a laying cycle where they're laid and then let to grow out and laid. Occasionally, they might have seen light trimming. But even with that, incremental trimming is nothing new. When they used to be managed by hand slashers, slashing up the hedge, the hand tools essentially wouldn't generally get through all of the year's growth. They would leave the sort of woody sort of growth that would have grown in spring, and it would have cut off the sort of soft, sappy, sugary stuff that grew in summer, and hedges would get sort of incrementally bigger. But really, the changes that we saw in the last century were that we got tools that were too good. We got flail tools and stuff that had the potential to take them right back down to the wick, and that had never really happened before. So the better machinery meant that we could trim them right back down to the wick every year, and that meant that they stopped sort of slowly moving through their cycle, and they stopped getting rejuvenated, and that's what we see quite a lot. Where hedgerows have fallen into less good condition, generally it's because they've dropped out of the cycle. But what we say is, just because you have the tools that can trim them all the way back each year, it really doesn't mean that we have to. So just easing off on the flail, allowing them a bit more breathing space, can get them back into moving through their cycles. So in essence, we've got sort of the opportunity really to combine traditional methods, new insights and modern tools. We're not talking about going back to hand tools, except for hedge laying, of course. And ideally, the hedge cycle doesn't have to be any more complicated than the one shown here. Laying, maybe some trimming if you want to, maybe a period of non-intervention, and then rejuvenation again. But by putting this sort of simple hedge life cycle into practice around your farm, you will naturally end up with hedges of different heights, different structures, different maturities, different densities, different food abundance. And this is really key to the landscape scale recovery of species that depend on them. Diversity loves diversity. And given that species have different needs from a hedge, ideally we want to see as many different types of hedge structure represented across the landscape at any one time. And to me, this is a great way of making sure that happens, whilst also ensuring we have a healthy future for our hedges. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. That was really interesting. It's amazing how much wildlife a hedge can hold. Really, that was really surprising to hear quite how much was there. So we'll move on to the Q&A section now. We've got quite a few in the chat, or not the chat, but the questions already. I think I've seen a few about the loss of the cross compliance. So one of the questions that I'd got down was really, how harmful do you see these kind of loss of protections from cross compliance being for hedgerows? I'll put that to both of you.
Well, I'll fire on if you want, Megan. I think for me the most harmful thing would be the hedge flailing, or the non-hedge flailing period, which at the moment is from 1st of March till end of August. And that, you know, if we're flailing hedges around in springtime or early summer or even into summer, the nesting birds, he just seems crazy, really. And I really hope that people don't see that as an opportunity to get on and get things flailed while it's nice and dry. It's, you know, even 1st of September is probably pushing it, really, you know, in some areas. So yeah, I really hope that people don't, but that to me is going to be the major problem. There is, of course, the legislation behind just, the if you are disturbing a known nesting area or whatever, or a bird's nest or whatever, but the you know, in terms of prosecution and things, that would be very hard to prove and stuff. So I think really we do need that legislation in there for the non-cutting period. It's a bare minimum, really.
I completely agree. That is a really scary one, the loss of the non-cutting period. But I think the other ones are quite intimidating too. Not being able to plough within 2 meters of the hedge centre. You know, it's I can't. I mean, I'm not envisaging most people going out there and ploughing right up to the hedge base as soon as they're able to. But you know, even just slowly, accidentally getting closer to that hedge base disturbs the roots of the hedges, the hedge trees, and it might not kill them outright, but the next drought might do. You know, the roots of the hedge, that hedge margin, those are really important, not just for the hedge wildlife, but actually to make sure that the hedge is healthy and robust. As soon as we start, you know, cultivating to a point where we might be disturbing hedgerow roots, you know, they become more vulnerable to whatever life has to throw at them. And we know life is going to be throwing a lot at them, droughts and floods and all sorts of things, more diseases. So we need to just make sure that they're in the best condition. So yeah, the non-cultivation one is a bit of a worry as well.
And of course, the 2 meters is nothing either. You know, it should really be, you know, 5 or 10 meters really. You know, because the mature hedges is, you know, those that have been setting down roots for hundreds of years, you know, those root systems are going to run, you know, 10, 15 meters out into the hedge really. So even if they're just a small roots, they're still going to have that reach. So yeah, 2 meters really is really just pushing it too close anyways.
Are there any points within the consultation that DEFRA have released that you think are particularly controversial? I know there's one question that touches on should small fields still have the kind of 2 meter width area. I think our viewpoint was that it should, because it's, as James says, it's not very wide still, 2 meters. But I just wondered whether there's anything else that either of you had noticed in the questions from the consultation that you thought could cause some controversial takes or anything like that.
Well, to me, I think is it 5 hectares? I think they call a small field.
Yeah.
We haven't got a field that's as big as 5 hectares. So I think our average field size is 5 acres, so it's less than actually. And we still manage to have plenty of boundaries uncultivated and unmown and things. So yeah, I think every hedge should have the same protection, whether it's around a small field or a 100-acre field.
I think that the crux of the consultation as well, not just the bits that they were consulting on in terms of what the legislation might look like going forward, but also how it's going to be monitored, how it's going to be regulated, was slightly opaque. It looks like there might be several tiers of different notices, and I just hope that whatever they do settle on, it's made very clear what the consequences of breaking of non-compliance with this regulations are, and you know what is expected, and you know what you can expect if you don't break the compliant, if you're non-compliant. So I think that, you know, it's just a confusing level of tiers of notices at the moment, and I hope they settle on something that they can put good clarity to.
Yeah, I do too. I think that probably everyone does in the wake of kind of SFI moving back and things like that as well. So we'll move on to some kind of more general hedge questions. So we'll just go for the ones that have got the most upvotes now. So we've got one that's, is there an optimum width for a healthy hedge? Someone's asked.
I can say, well, it's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like the height of a healthy hedge. What's the perfect height? What's perfect width? I think it depends on what stage of life you're in. No matter what size your hedge is, it's probably going to want to be bigger the following year and bigger the year after that. And then at some point, you're going to massively reduce it back down when you rejuvenate it. So I think wider hedges are better, certainly. They've been shown to be better for wildlife, wider hedges, and the width being more important than the height, interestingly. And I believe there's evidence to show that they're better for carbon storage as well, the width again being more important than the height. But to me, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint an optimum.
Yeah, I think I would agree there. Nice thick wide hedge is just great for wildlife and for carbon sequestration. And yeah, like Megan says, they get wider every year. You know, so even if they're fenced, the double fence, the hedge tends to go outside of that boundary anyways. And yeah, we have hedges that are 7-8 meters wide, and then when we get back to laying them, they take a bit of hacking back to the fence, then you've got to take the fence down, and then they get to less than a meter wide for your laid hedge. So I wouldn't worry about how wide they get, because they'll always come back again to that narrow bit once you've laid them.
So we've actually got another one about fenced hedges, so we'll go for that one. So a quick question about laying a hedge that's been fenced against livestock, both sides. Do you remove the fence first, jump over the fence and work within it? This person's planting some new double fenced hedges this winter, and if possible, they want to make their life easier. So when it comes to laying, so have you got any tips for fencing a hedge that is subsequently laid, or that is to be subsequently laid?
Yeah, so your first time you can probably get away with maybe just take the barbed wire off if you want, and then hop over and into the hedge box, as it were, because it's going to be fairly small, so you're probably 10 or 12 years growth or whatever for your first time you're going to lay it, and you can probably get away then because there isn't that much stuff to thin out. Maybe if you've got a really mature hedge that you've laid and then double fenced, so as you've got all that sort of big woody growth anyways, it quickly grows, it's quickly going to get outside of that hedge box, and then you're going to have to take the fence down to lay it. But we're only talking every 20 years that you're going to have to do that, by which time the fence posts are going to be rotten anyways, because they always are these days. And you can just reuse your wire again. If you're careful, you can reuse your wire, so you're just going to have to put new fence posts in. And that's what we do, and it's just part of our management really, and we just do that. But yeah, your fence posts are going to be rotten anyways in 20 years.
And then I think the next, unless you want to go on, Megan.
No, I was just going to say I've got nothing more to add to that. Is right, yeah. Big hedge is going to need that fence down, otherwise you're just going to be flopping it onto your barbed wire all the time.
So we've got one. They've managed they had been managing their hedgerows by flailing every year. They've now left them uncut, except on the roadside, for 3 years. They're wondering how and when to start up cutting them again. And most have been done by flail still due to the quantity, but how far back do they want to be cutting?
I would say even if you're doing a longer rotation, you can still cut them higher. The one thing I'd say is if they've been flailed for a long time and then put into a period of non-intervention, take another look at them when winter comes. So when the leaves are all off the hedge, have a look at the structures of those hedges, because after a long time of annual flailing, the stems tend to, a number of stems will fail. They'll start having like a high, we call it a base canopy. They just get a bit leggy, looking like the sort of mushrooms. And if it's got to that point before you put it into a non-intervention, it's probably better to rejuvenate it first, so you've got all of the regrowth coming from the bottom rather than from the trim line. So if you've got a hedge that's struggled with overflailing, then coppice or lay it before you put it into a non-intervention, just because you want all that growth from the bottom, not from any sort of knuckle line at the top. But when you do, if it's not in bad nick, and you do want to put it into a different regime, the sort of the 3-year cutting is fine, depending on what species you've got as well. If you've got fast growing species, you might want to use a circular saw attachment if someone's got one, and do it every 3-5 years, something like that. But the flail is if you just have the flail, you can do a decent job with the flail. It's just light flailing. It's just not going right back down to the wick. It's not going right back down to the previous year's growth, and making sure it's just slightly higher and higher and higher, and that creates that really good density that's great for birds and all those other benefits. So I think as long a rotation as you can justify, given the species in your hedge, and the machinery that you've got, but always slightly higher than the last time you cut it as well.
Anything to add, James?
No, I think that's about it. Thanks, Megan.
You just take it in turns. So somebody else has asked that they've got some young hedges in 3 to 4 years. When should they start laying those hedges?
Yeah, I would have said 10 or 12 years probably, but it depends really. I mean, if you're in a really growy area, somewhere that has loads of moisture, it's nice and sheltered, the ground's really fertile, you might be able to do it at 8 or 9 years. If you're stuck on top of a drafty hill with thin soils, it's really exposed, then it might be 15, 18 years before you're going to have a go at it. So yeah, just sort of checking the sort of the growth. The growth rates of it really. Some of them are going to be, they'll probably all have big at the bottom by then, but then that depends on species as well. So if you're looking at like nuts or hazels or hawthorn, then you really want to be, you don't want to be laying anything under 2 inches really for new stuff, and then just lay it before it gets too knotted up. Because that's what they tend to do. New stuff tends to get really, really knotty, especially hawthorn. They don't tend to grow up. They tend to just twist themselves together, and it's probably worse doing new stuff if you're leaving them for sort of 20, 25 years than it is doing it at that 10 or 12 year stage.
Yeah, exactly. I'll add to it that letting it grow and laying it is the best way to establish a hedge. That is hands down the gold star A+ way of making a new hedge. To me, a hedge isn't a proper hedge unless it's had that sort of first, we call it a maiden lay. It's a weird term, but until it's had that first lay, it's not like a proper established hedge. And it does lots of really good things. So if you plant them, let them grow up. Around me, it's between 7 and 10 years, because again, we're quite wet and it is a fast growing area. Between 7 and 10 years. In the Midlands, I've heard it's sort of 15ish years. But yeah, as James said, once it gets to the point where you can sort of reasonably lay them and get a good structured laid hedge, you go for it. And the benefits are huge. So you've got about 10ish years of untrimmed growth, which is great. So that's sort of like 8 years of flowers and fruits and all sorts of stuff before you've even had to do anything. Also, it means it's a great opportunity to take those spiral guards off, and let's be honest, there is never enough time in the day to do that if you don't have the good excuse of laying in. And it also means this, we call it a spiral shadow, that there's a sort of a bit towards the ground where they've got no branches on because they've had a spiral tube on there. Laying a young hedge basically removes that spiral shadow as well. And for every one whip that you plant, so you generally like 5 whips per meter on a double staggered line or whatever, each one whip that you plant, once you give it that first lay, that turns into 5 or so new stems. So you really get a much, much more sort of like substantial, thick, decent, chunky hedge at the end of it. By far my preferred way of establishing a good hedge.
Great. We've also got a question kind of about, when establishing hedges from scratch, what would you recommend as the best form of weed control in the first few years of establishment?
I've seen a lot on Twitter, people using sheep's wool. So if you're in an area that's got lots of sheep, sheep's wool unfortunately doesn't have such a market that it used to, but makes a really great weed control and mulch as well. So it provides really good mulch. And the photos that I've seen, I mean, I haven't done it myself, so I can't say it for sure, but the photos that I've seen just make it look like a fantastic treatment. Other than that, cutting them, trimming them, and maybe mulching them with whatever you've got to hand, whatever's suitable locally, really. But to be honest, I don't get overly bothered with weeds unless the weeds are going to completely swamp out your hedge. Sometimes the weeds, especially when you've got a period of drought, can create a bit of a microclimate around your young saplings, can actually stop them drying out a bit. So I'm not hugely worried about there being some weeds at the bottom of a young hedge, as I said, unless it's swamping out the growth completely.
Yeah, I would agree with Megan on that. I'm not particularly bothered either by it. We've never had much of a problem when we've been planting new hedges and and having it swamped out by the excessive grass growth and stuff. And I think there was one section we did where it was really fertile and so the grass did get away, and we just used the small whips rather than the bigger ones, so they were just the sort of 30cm ones. So all we did, we just went along and just hand rolled a bit of grass for the first summer, and it was a dead quick thing to do. As long as you've not got hay fever, you're all right. You can just go along, pull it out, and that just gives a little bit of chance to get some light in. But yeah, like Megan says, it does tend to hold a bit of moisture in as well and keeps a bit of structure in the soil and stuff.
With that in mind, we've got a question on, with climate change considerations, what are your views on non-native, more drought-tolerant tree species included in newly planted hedgerows?
We've got drought-tolerant native species, though.
I wouldn't plant any non-native stuff in. You know, we've got heaps of species in this country, and just look around as to what's growing well in your area, and just use them. You know. And maybe use a local nursery as well. Don't use it's no good us in Cumbria using a nursery from Devon, because it's it's a bit different climate. So I would use a local nursery if you can, so obviously also keeping the money in the local area as well. So
and I think just in a bit of an addition, making sure that you've got sort of local genotypes, so the local genetics represented in young planting. It's really difficult to do because even local nurseries don't often use local seed source, but I think it's one of the really good reasons why we should be establishing, maintaining our existing hedges and making sure that we don't lose the genetic diversity within those, because we've got the genetic diversity of our native tree populations is largely within our hedgerows. So we really need to make sure that we maintain all of that, because they're genetic individuals like us. Some are better in some situations, some are better in others. I think you can really see it with oaks in particular. You can see some oaks might struggle in the drought, some oaks are fine in it, and it's all to do with their like individual genetics. So making sure that we've got all of the genes that are currently in our hedges staying there by rejuvenating them, by laying them, and making sure that we look after our existing hedges. I think we should have the sort of genetic diversity within our native populations to be fine.
On that, we've had a few people requesting that stat that I think you had, James, on your presentation about water storage, and how much hedges actually store water.
I skipped over it because I knew I was going to be running over, so I just I've photographed it and I'll just read it. Hedgerows are efficient in the storage and slow release of water during heavy rainfall events. 50 meters of hedge in a 1 hectare field stores between 150 and 375 cube of water. So that's a huge amount of water on a short length. Hedgerows and trees reduce soil water content from across the field system, especially on slope. So it's great at filtering soil runoff as well, with the amount of water that they can store. And that's 50 meters of mature hedge Joshua is talking about, when it's storing all that water between 150 and 375 cubic meters of water. So they are just, and that's storing it to then slowly release it. So it's storing it to prevent floods, but then also it's storing it to then slowly release it during drought periods as well. So really vital that we do have healthy hedges to be able to do that, because an unhealthy hedge isn't going to store much.
And it does, it means a deeper part of your soil profile can soak up the water as well, because a lot of the water storage, it might be within the plants, but a lot of it's actually just through capillary action, so the water literally following the roots into the soil. So if you've got grass, it will follow the water into the soil as much as the grass roots go, but the hedge roots and the tree roots go deeper, so a deeper sort of part of the soil profile can actually act like that sponge and soak it all up.
Then we've got a couple on different species. So we've got, what do you find is the best method to control elder?
Pull it out.
This is a controversial one. I really like elder. It's got a place in our countryside. The berries, the flowers, it's fantastic for wildlife. It's really good for things like some of our deadwood dependent invertebrates. They spend a lot of time as larvae in old trees, and then they come out and they've got 6 weeks and they go to things with splays of white flowers, so elder, hogweed, that sort of thing. I know it can cause problems in hedges, but I like to see the positive side of things. So I like to see them as indicator species. So when you've got elder, I don't like to use the term, but invading a hedge, it's just often an indicator that hedge needs a little bit of work, because it wouldn't be able to invade it if there wasn't a crack. If it was properly strong, dense and healthy, elder wouldn't find that crack to get in. What elder does when it's in there is it's really fast growing, generally faster than the other species in your hedge. So it sort of elbows a crack and sort of elbows it out and turns it into a gap. And then of course it dies because elder is a short-lived tree species, so it can leave a hole. So it can do some damage to a hedge, but to me, I like to see it as an indicator that change is needed in the way you're managing a hedge. A lot of hedge layers pull them out when you lay hedges. I would say if you've got some by a gateway, maybe keep them by a gateway. It's not going to do as much damage there. But I don't know, it depends how much you've got, really, I'd say.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of elder in our hedges, and yet we pull loads out and we cut it off. I wouldn't be worried about cutting every single alder off that you see in a hedge when you're hedge laying it, because like Megan says, they will quickly grow again. And then of course, when you're hedge laying, you're moving your hedge laying rotation around the farm, so you're not going to do all the way around one field every year. In the same year, you're going to do one boundary and then move on to one other side of the farm. So you're moving it around, so you're getting different stages of growth for that hedge and for that elder and stuff anyway. So there's always going to be loads of flowers and loads of loads of elderberries about anyway. So yeah, we've got a huge amount, and yeah, we do pull them out. I would never plant an elder, because birds will do that for you. So yeah.
You do find them in hedge planting mixes though, which astonishes me.
And the other one that I've seen, which is on a specific species, was that somebody's got a line of mature hawthorn, and they read that hawthorn doesn't coppice very well, or lay well. So are there any suggestions on how they can rejuvenate hawthorn?
Hawthorn does lay,
yeah,
and it does coppice, but not past a certain point. If it's got really gnarly at the bottom and it's a bit rotten, then it might not spring back. It depends how far gone it is. If it is really, really far gone and it's not going to spring up from the base, then maybe choose a few of your best examples and keep them up as hedgerow trees. Hawthorn isn't just a sort of hedging mix, it can be a hedgerow tree as well. Coppice the ones that you think might spring back, and see what you can do.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. That picture that I showed where they were all laid out, all those unmanaged trees, hedgerow trees, and yeah, half of them were dead or half of them didn't regrow when we coppiced. But I think there's a stat where a healthy hawthorn tree left as a hedgerow tree has the same biodiversity value as 100 meters of failed hedge or something. So having a healthy hawthorn tree as a standard tree, they do look fantastic as well. The amount of blossom that you get on them, especially when it's sort of got the sort of nurture of the hedge alongside it as well. So yeah, hawthorn is like 80% of our hedgerow species, I would think, hawthorn.
I would say hawthorns as hedgerow trees, whilst we're on that topic, they're a really good option as a small hedge tree. So if you've got some sort of east-west hedges and you don't want to put in a big oak or a beech, something that's going to shade out your field, so your east-west hedges, hawthorn, rowan, things like that, they make really good crabapple, really good little hedgerow trees that aren't going to cause too much shading impact. And then you can keep your oaks and your beeches for your north-south hedges, so it doesn't shade out, but might give you some prevailing wind protection.
And then we've got another one here. Could we talk a little bit about dead hedging? So not as live, but seems to provide a wonderful framework for a wildlife corridor and support for botanical species, and uses that brash very well. So I don't know whether we can touch on that a bit.
Yeah, I've done dead hedging. It's brilliant. It's great. It's a really good way of sort of delineating things as well. Like if you want to show something's purposeful, that's the way I've done it. It's showing an area of rough area of places is purposeful. You can sort of just put a dead hedge around it, or it could maybe be used to connect up bits of hedges that are gappy through something that you're not going to be able to fix so easily. So if you've got a massive great canopy oak and it's got a gap in the hedge underneath it, you're not really going to be able to establish a new hedge underneath the canopy of a big old oak. So you might be able to sort of forge the connectivity back through putting dead hedging sort of between the living bits of the hedge underneath that oak canopy. But yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a great way of using up brash without having to burn it. It slowly rots down into the soil. It's great. It's not as good as living hedging, but it's
has its
really
uses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I've just noticed that we've had another one come through on another kind of species specific. So they've got any advice on a hedge full of sycamore? It grows very fast and tall, so needs cutting annually. Coppicing is question mark. So any
You can lay it. We have some bits of sycamore in, but they're very springy, you know, and they're not good for flailing as well, because they tend to bounce up a lot. So yeah, it's not a great hedgerow species, but if that's all there is in there, then that's what there is. So yeah, you can lay it, but they do tend to be very bouncy and very springy, and they always want to escape from their from the stakes that you're putting in.
It might be a decent option for a firewood coppiced rotation hedge, because it does grow so quickly. I'd say coppiced rotation firewood.
Great. So now we've had a few questions about people feeling maybe slightly intimidated by hedge laying, and are there any courses or any infographics or anything like that that you can kind of point people in the direction of, as to kind of, and maybe advisors for people that are just getting started on hedge laying? Including yourself, probably.
I think the National Hedge-laying Society have got some courses. If you're going to get properly into it, they've got some courses and some accreditation schemes. Or loads of places do like a day course or a weekend course. Once you've got the hang of it and you understand the general what to do and what not to do, you know, it takes a while to become decent at it, you know, like competition standard, with all the twizzly bits at the top and the stakes, and they're doing it all to that sort of competition standard. But I'd say I am not a very good hedge layer at all. But none of the hedges I've ever laid have come back worse. So I'd say don't be intimidated by it. Once you know the general principles, get out there and practice. Maybe practice on a youngish hedge that doesn't have too much rot in it. When they're all sort of young and springy, it's a little bit easier. But yeah, do a day course, understand the principles, and then have a go, because it's difficult to mess up, basically, as long as you're doing it safely and you don't do any harm to yourself.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just probably learn the basics, understand those first, and then get on and have a go, and you'll only get better by getting out there and by trying. Basics for me are pretty much, well, obviously laying uphill, so you're always laying it uphill, and then just getting, when you are cutting your pleats, as they call it in other parts of the country, when you are ligging, as we call it up here, just get your lig down as low as you can, because next time in 20 years when you come and do it again, you can't go any lower than what you've done then. So you really need to get it as low as you can every time you're doing it. And like my dad always says, you're not laying it for this time, you're laying it for next time. So if you make a mess of it this time, it'll be much harder to do next time. So just try and understand the basics first, and then get on and have a go. And it's great fun. I love it.
I think it's actually quite addictive as well. As soon as you've laid a hedge, you sort of you understand the process emotionally as well as intellectually, and seeing it regrow is, I think, one of life's joys, is seeing a hedge come back from whatever it started with before you laid it. The one warning I would say is, once you've got into hedge laying, you are going to drive around the countryside going, oh, that one is laying, oh, I'd let that one off, and you're just going to see it everywhere. I think hedges that you'd love to get stuck into.
And we've also got one kind of more on the SFI kind of grant management side. So with the need to record and monitor hedgerow management and development, do you have any suggestions for kind of photographic hardware and things and apps that people could use to help with that? Or just on your phone?
Yeah, well, we can do it on your phone, but then you can just record that picture with 3 words or whatever. So then you're monitoring it from the same point each time. You could create your own sort of scoring system if you wanted. And I have seen a scoring system somewhere for a State of Hedgerow. Megan's nodding; she's probably done one.
So Nigel Adams of the Hedge-laying Society created what we call the Adams 10-point scale, and basically it's just the point of the hedge life cycle that it's at. I actually created an app that might be useful. It's called Healthy Hedgerows, and basically it's just 6 questions. So it's you don't have to do any measuring, it's all estimates. You drop a pin at the beginning and a pin at the end. You give you say, you know, which hedge is it on the scale of the 10-point scale, rough height, rough width, rough estimation of the gaps, a number of trees, and then the base canopy, and that's it. And it records it all digitally. You can sort of export the stuff as well, but it doesn't just sort of it doesn't just record the current assessment of the hedge. It gives you management options. So between those questions, it works out where in the life cycle you are, and what your hedge would benefit from, and just suggests a few options of what you might want to consider next. So yeah, it's called Healthy Hedgerows. It's totally free. I developed it over lockdown, and it was a great fun project.
So we've got a question about wildlife hedge laying, because they understand it's a bit less structured than traditional hedge laying, and they'd kind of appreciate your guys' thoughts on that.
Is that, I presume, where they're just almost doing it, just a massive, great big ligs, as we would call them, cutting with a chainsaw and just pushing them over with machines? Yeah, in terms of a sort of a livestock farm situation, I don't think that's really something that you would do. It's maybe something you could do on much bigger areas of land where you're not wanting to have a defined boundary. Maybe sometimes, I don't know. It certainly wouldn't work on a livestock farm. I know that, but maybe in some more situations on nature reserves and things like that, it might be more suitable. I don't know. Have you got anything to say on that, Megan?
Yeah, well, there's sort of two non-traditional hedge laying sort of things. One's the wildlife one, which is nicking it with a chainsaw and then pushing it over with a front loader. And I've not actually seen the regrowth of these hedges laid like this yet. So I'm cautiously optimistic that it might have a really good role for wildlife, but couldn't necessarily say with what hedges and in what situations it is suitable. The other option is something called conservation hedge laying, and that's again, I think, masterminded by Nigel Adams, which is doing the traditional pleaching cut, so with hand tools, billock or maybe chainsaw, depending on what stage, and then doing that traditional pleach and taking it down, taking some of the brash out, but not as much brash, not doing the sort of posts, the binders, and any of the sort of more traditional elements. So the way that Nigel sort of developed this means that the hedge laying can be like twice as fast as sort of the traditional sort of Midland style or whatnot, so twice as cost effective, really. And I think it's potentially a compromise somewhere between traditional hedge laying and the sort of chainsaw and the dumper truck.
Yeah, that's great. We've got a couple of questions around old hedges, kind of where could you find advice on the best course of action for an old hedge? And then there's also another one about looking at kind of recent studies showing that there's a lot of additional soil carbon continues to be sequestered under hedges for up to at least 70 years, and that they're worried that if a lot of hedges are only counted up to 25 years, they're concerned that this will encourage unnecessary removal and replanting of old hedges. Is there something we need to be doing with kind of carbon calculators to kind of, is this something we need to be championing basically to make sure they're appreciating old hedges?
In terms of this first question, which was managing...
Yeah, managing an old hedge.
Managing an old hedge, yeah. I mean, all hedges are old, hopefully, if they're on an ancient boundary anyways. Like I said, I think in my talk, that no hedge is beyond repair unless it's dead. There's always something you can do, and it's just whether you went down. So Megan did it really well where she said about, where you're coppicing or you're laying, or I forget what the other one was, but you've got various options depending on where they're at. But we're always game for ligging something really challenging, just because we don't like to be beat. And if it runs off, so if you're pleaching, if you're cutting through and for whatever reason, maybe a gust of wind comes and it blows just as you're about to bring it down beautifully, and it comes off, it's fine because you can just coppice it. So I would always try and lay first, and then if you get beat, well, you can just coppice that one. It's fine, and just stick a couple more plants in if you're replanting around it. The important thing, I think, like Megan says, really is that we try and manage these existing hedges and try and maintain the species that are in there, because a lot of these hedgerows, they're hundreds and hundreds of years old. They could be 1,000 years old, these boundaries. Some of those species in there will be from 1,000 years ago. There could be the actual one, and all it's done is it might not be in the same place. It's just maybe just moved up the hedge. So when it's been laid, it's grown back in again, and then over hundreds of years, it might have migrated 100 meters up the hedge or whatever. So yeah, it's really important that we do keep those existing things in there. Try and layer them. If not, then we can just copy them off, and then you at least you're maintaining that plant identity in there.
Yeah, nothing more
Got
to add to
anything
that. No,
Yeah.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Although old, I don't know whether old meant old or mature. I tend to tell about old and mature because, yeah, as James said, like most of our hedges are really old, but they go through the cycles. So it's how mature they are. But for mature hedges, you know, as James said, most of them, it depends how brave you are. Depends how brave your hedge layer is. But you know, if you're brave, you can attempt it. You know, some species don't do so well after a certain point of maturity. Once beech has got to a certain sort of size, it doesn't like it as much.
Holly as well, the same.
Yeah, holly always snaps on me. But again, yeah, if it snaps off, then you've got a coppiced instead of a lay. And to be honest, you know, if we're not doing this in a competition, I think it's still valuable rejuvenation.
Yeah, that's great. We had a few kind of questions on after we'd talked about different courses that people might be able to go on for hedge laying. Do we know if there's any funding for going on those courses, or what the kind of average cost it would be to get somebody in to do that hedge laying for you, if it's not something you've got time to or the skill to do yourself?
The rates for hedge laying have just gone up quite significantly. They're almost double what they were, I think. So it's now, you know, if you're part of a scheme, you can get a decent amount of money that I think covers the entirety of your hedge laying if you get a hedge layer in. I think actually even if you're doing your own hedges, you can still get that grant, which is pretty good. In terms of cost for the courses, I think that depends where you are and what course. I mean, some places run courses, day courses for free. Wildlife Trust, CPRE, you'll often find a free hedge laying course there. It might just be a day course. You can get a more in-depth course and accreditation through the National Hedge Laying Society if you're getting, you know, serious about it. But yeah, I think they're all of sort of varying price schemes, but not out of the world expensive.
I think Cumbria Farmer Network, I know they fund courses, you know, so they will fund things like that. So it could be, they also fund things like foot trimming and an AI course and stuff, but they also would fund the hedge laying course as well. Up to £200 or something. So if you a member of the Cumbria Farmer Network, but I have put it to people from DEFRA, APIA, whoever, that they should really set some money aside within their agricultural budget for training new hedge layers, because there is a huge amount of hedges been planted in the last 5 years. Within 10 years, they're all going to be to lay, and there ain't going to be enough people to do it. So, you know, and you can make good money. You know, you can make good money being a hedge layer, especially on new hedges. So if you want to have a different income through winter and have some fun, learn how to hedge and yeah, and start reaping the rewards.
I convinced my sister to. She trained as a hedge layer last year.
Oh,
she's a gardener normally, and then I took her to the National Hedge Laying Championships, and she was convinced that she's a winter hedge layer now.
No, great way to kind of diversify your skill set then, isn't it, really? We've got a couple now, and I think we mentioned that you fenced some of yours, but we've just had a few about stock proofing hedges, and can you eventually remove the fence from the hedge line and let them graze, or do you keep the fence there the whole time, basically?
Yeah, so we'd keep ours up all the time. But some boundaries we just use a barbed wire. You know, so if we don't have had any sheep, there's only a few sheep. So if there's no sheep going to be in that field, then we just use a strand of barbed wire on an established hedge that has been hedge laid. If you are establishing a new hedge, then you have to put the sheep netting up, even if you just got cattle, because a barbed wire isn't enough to stop it. And it also protects a bit from deer and things as well. But we just leave the fence up in situ then until we're going to until we're going to hedge lay it next time. So once they're up really. And it does just protect that. Just protect the hedge as well a bit from, you know, just from machines and things. Really gives it a bit of a boundary, really, that you will respect a bit more. I think you and the animals will respect a bit more.
I think it depends what your concerns are. If your concerns are for the hedge, and it depends what animals you've got as well. I mean, sheep will eat from the ground up and give you a sort of lollipop stick hedge. Cattle do browse totally differently, and they sort of go from there downwards and actually create a nice sort of skirt and flank to the hedge. So if it's the hedge you're worried about, then it depends what livestock you've got. If it's how stock proof it is, then I guess it depends, you know, where in the cycle your hedge is, and how far apart, how far spaced the stems are.
But the hedge, when it's fenced, the hedge always grows over the fence, and the stock can browse. That, you know, the sheep can browse to the netting, to the sheep netting, and then cattle will always browse atop. So, you know, they do keep it, you know, under control a bit, you know, so they don't get too unruly if people are worried about that. But yeah, I mean, cattle browsing hedges, it's part of their diet here. You know, they really do value it.
What benefits have you noticed from them kind of browsing at the hedges?
They go for different things, different times of year. So they love in spring and in autumn. They just love like the Hawthorn, the sort of sweet tips of that. They seem to go with that a lot, and the hazels. But even, you know, going back hundreds of years, you know, it would be the tree hair. You know, they were very much so. So Megan was showing someone slashing hedges and stuff. Well, they would be gathering all that up, they would be drying it, and then that would be the tree hair. And so it was just another type of fodder. Strictly, actually, our farm name is named after tree hair. It's the stirk hair. That was the sort of the hedge fodder that they were getting. So yeah, it's very much part of our history of our farm as well.
I think it's a folly to believe that cows only eat grass. I think, you know, you turn cows into a fresh field of pasture, and inevitably some of them are going to go straight to the hedge or to whatever tree they can get. And it depends what, you know, nutrients they're in need of, what time of year it is. But yeah, they don't just eat grass. They're browsing animals.
And James, you still make tree hay? Is there a particular strategy for that? I'm just wondering whether there's anyone that's listening that might be now thinking that they might want to have a go at tree hay.
I'm sure there is books and things to Google on it, but no, we have long since stopped doing that. But in terms of browsing the green stuff, you know, I always just go at it all the time. And like Megan says, it just sort of, it just depends what they want. And cows, if you have a full range of species in your hedge, on a boundary, the cattle will go and get what they want. You know, they know far better than we do. So having a single species hedge doesn't give them much option. So just have as many species in there as you can.
And we've had somebody ask, what's the optimal distance from the centre of the hedge for kind of new sheep net fencing to be placed? Is there an optimal distance, or is it just so they can't get too close? I
think stewardship guide, is it? I forget what a stewardship guide is. It a metre or a metre and a half? I can't remember. But that's the minimum, really. You know. But I wouldn't be too worried about having it too close, really. You know, if you just want to do a metre, I can't remember whether that's for stewardship or not. So you've got like a 2 metre hedge box. It'll always grow outside of that anyway. So I wouldn't be too, you know, you want to give it plenty of room, and it depends on your management. If you want to have a much wider hedge box, so you can maybe do some management within that, you know, a hedge lane, or you want a really wide, thick, you know, wildlife boundary, or if you've got loads of small fields and you just want to, you know, like the minimum, then you go for that. But you know, if it's an area where it's a really rough bank or something like that you're putting a hedge up and you're not that bothered about, you know, losing ground in inverted commas, then just, you know, put a wider one in, just give that hedge space to grow.
Anything else, Megan?
I agree about management. It depends how you're managing your hedge, because if you're laying it and then leaving it, then you've got a little bit more flexibility. I think if you want to be doing some trimming in the interim, you might want to have enough space to get the flail head in. So I guess it depends what sort of management you want. And you know, if they are in a trimming regime as well as a life cycle, then just have a think of how long are you going to leave it between trims? So how far is it going to grow out? Are you going to be able to get your flail head in there?
No, that's great. So I think as we're getting kind of close to the time when we said we finished, probably just kind of do one last question, which is how are we going to get everyone to move away from kind of flailing every year and moving to this kind of better hedgerow management practices?
Try public shaving or something like that. I don't know, but no, I think just getting people to see the benefits of healthy hedgerows. So that could be financial through, you know, SFI or whatever. It could be paying farmers, landowners to manage their hedges better. It could be the benefits of having a healthy hedgerow to your farm and your livestock and wildlife. You know, there'll be different things will appeal to different people. But getting all that information out there so people can see it and people can see the benefits of having a well-managed, healthy hedge, I think is the way forward. So, but number one for a lot of people might be money, and if it comes down to being cheaper to manage hedges better, more cost-effective to manage hedges better with SFI payments or stewardship payments than it is with hammering it with a flail every year. Yeah, I think that'll be a better way.
I think there's I'm hoping, I don't know whether this is just sort of naively optimistic, but the inclusion of incremental trimming in the new SFIs, I'm hoping is going to be a bit of a game changer, because from a point of view of a farmer, it's not difficult to do. It's basically the same as annual flailing, but just doing it slightly higher and slightly wider. So it's not difficult. It's an easy win for the money. It's a very easy win, and I like to see it as a bit of a gateway drug to good hedgerow management, because it's easy, but it shows almost instant results. You know, even if you're trimming in September, which, you know, I wouldn't advise, you've still got leaves on your hedge. Your hedge will blossom beautifully. It will fruit beautifully. It will look like really nice. It basically has really instant effects for very little sort of change in practice. And I think as soon as you realize how much you can benefit, how good your hedges can look with a change of management, if you're not just annually flailing them down to the wick, then I'm hoping that's going to sort of just awaken this world of changing attitudes towards hedgerow management. But yeah, like James says, I think also understanding how valuable they are to the farm. I mean, we haven't gone to all of this trouble laying hedges for 1,000 years to just to keep the cows in. You know, they've always been really valuable to farms, and I think we've lost a little bit of sight of that nationally. And I think I'm hoping that as people sort of warm up to the on-farm benefits, not just the wildlife benefits, but the on-farm benefits, I'm really hoping that that's going to have an impact as well.
No, that's both great. Hopefully we'll see a huge uptake in hedgerow management to better standards as we go forward. I'd just like to thank you both again. You've answered the questions brilliantly. We've had a lot of amazing feedback from everyone already. So just thanks very much. If there's any last thoughts or advice you want to give for anybody on managing their hedges, I'll let you have a quick final word now. Megan, what do you want to
I could start. I think have a look at them come winter. Go out in winter and just have a nice walk. Have a look at the different structures and just look at the base. Look at how far spaced the different stems are, and just think, you know, would this benefit from a change of management? And just consider if you're new to managing a hedge on a life cycle, start with 1 or 2. You don't have to go whole hog just to begin with. Start with 1 or 2, and as soon as you see, you know, how quickly they come back, how, you know, amazingly they come back, I think it will be a game changer.
Yeah, I think, yeah, well, I would just agree with everything Megan said there. It's just learning the small stuff about your hedges, you know, getting out of there, looking at them, seeing what different species are in there, and then just, yeah, trying different forms of management on there. And if you want to leave 50 meters that you want to lay in, you know, they've been flailing every year. If you want to leave 5-7 years or whatever, you'll be able to see that change. And just try it. Just get out there and try some different management, different hedge laying, and just you will love it. you know, Hedges give back far more than we ever give them. So I think they're really, really special things.
Well, yeah, thank you both again. Thank you everyone for coming as well. I think I put in the chat, so hopefully if you all saw the kind of message I put in the chat about our education bit, and if you've got any wonderful photos or videos of your hedges and how you manage them on your farm and some of the benefits you see, please do get in touch about them. But yeah, we'll sign off now from this webinar. So thanks very much everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.